program here. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to Public Health Grand Rounds at the Aspen Institute, which is one of several initiatives run by the Health Medicine and Society program. We are the domestic policy program of the Aspen Institute. Public Health Grand Rounds is held periodically here at the Institute to spotlight either a health-related issue or the work of an individual in the field of health. And you can read more about Public Health Grand Rounds and about Health Medicine Society and the Institute in general. Just check out our website. Today's Public Health Grand Rounds session is actually part of a larger program that is being held at the Institute all day today. The title of it is the Misinformation Solutions Forum. The forum is supported and co-hosted both by the Rita Allen Foundation and RTI International. And I want to extend our thanks to both organizations for producing the forum, allowing us to work with them on this incredibly exciting and important work, and for including Public Health Grand Rounds on today's agenda. It's been a great pleasure to work with both organizations and their staff. Now, in keeping with today's theme of the forum, misinformation, the focus of today's Public Health Grand Rounds is misinformation, but particularly as that concept relates to health and healthcare. Our guest today for a discussion on this very timely topic is Dr. Brian Southwell, who is an editor of a new book, Misinformation and Mass Audiences. This is what it looks like. Dr. Southwell directs the Science in the Public Sphere program at the Center for Communication Science at RTI International. He is also a faculty member at Duke University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and hosts a public radio show, The Measure of Everyday Life, which I understand is a big, big hit down there in North Carolina. I should add that Dr. Southwell was a featured speaker at the annual Spotlight Health program, which I hope most of you know is part of the Aspen Ideas Festival. Brian was a speaker back in 2017 where he participated in a panel discussion on fake health news. I, at that time, only knew Brian by reputation. We made a connection there, and our involvement since that time, and actually today's forum itself, is a direct result of that initial interaction, and we're so excited that that connection continues, and I hope will continue to grow. So Brian, before we jump in, I just want to mention and thank you for the 150 copies of this book that are outside and will be available to each of you at the conclusion of today's program for free. But I would ask that each of you only take one copy so we make sure that everyone gets one. And Brian, thank you again for that. Just a quick note on how we're going to proceed. Brian and I are going to be in conversation for about 30 minutes about the book. Then we're going to take questions from all of you, and I have no doubt there are going to be a lot of them. We have microphones that we will make available for the questions, so if you'll just give our runners a minute to get a mic to you, I'd greatly appreciate it. We will hopefully get to everyone. So Brian, let's jump in. Okay. Your book actually is a collection of essays. You're the editor that, taken together, looks at various dimensions of misinformation. One, audience awareness of misinformation. Two, ways in which misinformation can have consequences for outcomes that matter both to individuals and to society at large. And third, potential solutions in how we deal with the misinformation issue. So I want to begin by asking, so that we're all operating off the same page, so to speak, by defining some of the concepts that you talk about in the book. And let's start with the obvious first one. What do you mean by misinformation?
Great, Ruth. Well, I want to thank you and the Aspen Institute for the chance to be here. I want to thank you for such an easy first question, which isn't really the case. You might as well have just asked me, what is truth? In which case,
but wait a minute, I'm going to get to that.
Okay, well, it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
If I really had the answer to that, we would have written a much more interesting book than we did. So there's obviously a deeper metaphysical conversation that we can have, about the whole notion of whether reality exists and all of that, right? And I want to acknowledge that, and we do in the book. That said, our stance is that we believe that consensus is possible, as to the existence of certain facts, in the world. We've tended to focus on, and there's an important point here, about misinformation as a category of claims. It's not necessarily being monolithic, not necessarily being one thing, even though there's a catchphrase And there are multiple catchphrases in circulation out there right now, and we could spend some time even talking about whether those are helpful or not. But the notion of misinformation, we've tended to focus on the constellation of inaccurate claims. And thinking about the possibility of something as being inaccurate when put to the full judgment of having full information and seeing what the near universal or universal consensus would be. Of course, that means that there are certain things. I could claim that the sky is blue, and we could have a deeper philosophical discussion about whether or not that's the case. We've tended to focus in the book more so on the fact that Brian said the sky was blue, and that we would probably all be able to agree, hopefully, given a bunch of evidence and information that I had, in fact, made that statement. But as I said, somewhat in jest, it is a difficult question definitionally, such so that we thought we'd read a book about it, that we would really struggle with this as a concept. So part of the book is about this notion and whether we can fruitfully actually ever rid the system of quote-unquote misinformation, or whether this is part of a larger phenomenon that we must need to deal with. And so we go into great detail with that notion there. So it's a great place to start.
And I want to get to how we deal with it or get rid of it altogether in a little bit. Let me ask you this. Is there a difference between the concepts of misinformation and disinformation?
That's a great question, Ruth. I actually think it's fair to distinguish, but rather the way that we've treated misinformation in the book, and I want to thank, actually have some of our co-authors here with us today. It's a wonderful group of people. I really feel honored to have worked with such a great team to put this together. We use the notion of misinformation as an umbrella term, of which we view disinformation as a particular subset. From an ethical perspective, many of you are probably most exercised, most worried about disinformation. And what we tend to attribute to the notion of disinformation is malicious intent, active agency, an active effort to deceive. It's quite possible for information to be inaccurate, to be misleading, and not to be intentionally put out into the world to be such. There's a lot of noise in the system, and we wanted to make sure that we also were allowing for that. There's sometimes instances where that occurs, and it wasn't a specific malicious actor. That said...
Let me interrupt. What would be a good example of that?
Of which? Of misinformation?
Right.
Or of
misinformation not intentionally put out there.
Right. Imagine even a particular fact that was reported as such. I actually think about this here in Washington, D.C. I often go back to this example. Instances where, on air, there was reported that there was a fire on the mall, essentially. And that ultimately turned out to not be true. It had been a matter of, either camera angles or sort of misperception of what exactly had happened that day. But there was reporting that went out, and it was later corrected. And I think in that particular case, there was not active evidence that was intentionally spread as a piece of information. However, it was an inaccuracy. It's conceivable that I would call you Barbara rather than Ruth, or there are things that could be uttered that are not fair statements, but that nonetheless are false. There are other instances in which I actively am trying to deceive, and I promise I won't do that to any of you today. But that's a really useful distinction, and that's going to it's going to matter quite a bit for some people in terms of the ethics involved and what we do to potentially deal with various actors. But in the book, we also have an orientation towards trying to not necessarily always worry just about agency per se and the original genesis of claims, but rather also to think, well, what do we do about it, and to what extent are we all involved in this process of spreading misinformation under some circumstances? How is it we might deal with this collectively, and how is it that there might be good or intention that we may not be as worried about ethically that actually leads to some of the problems of misinformation that we have?
So let me get back to the point that you raised, and I said I would ask you, what exactly is truth in light of the distinctions you've just made?
Yeah.
And does Rudy Giuliani actually have a point when he says truth is not truth if key facts are in dispute?
Right. So I'm going to respectfully focus on the first part of your question.
Oh, no. I'm not going to let you off so easy.
Okay. So, but to start.
Yes.
So there's been an interesting reaction. There's an excerpt of the book was published in American Scientist magazine. And one of the things that people often say you shouldn't read online comments or reviews of your work, we tend to try to embrace all of that and see the range of viewpoints and opinions that are out there. There's a really interesting critique of the tactic we took to really kind of thinking about truth here, which is we focused on the possibility of consensus and assuming that there is an objective reality out there, but it's one that, as all human beings in this game together, that there are possibilities for agreement and that widespread agreement under situations of full information is possible. And we received some criticism that possibly philosophically is a dangerous road to go down. And I acknowledge, I understand that, that line of argument, but thinking from a communication science perspective, a philosophy perspective, that notion of the possibility of our general agreement is kind of where the scholarship in this area tends to lead. For others with a deeper rooted metaphysical orientation towards or a theological orientation towards the world, of course, there's lots of ways we might answer that question. But we've tended to focus our work on the bounded set of human sensation and our understanding and engagement with the world. And I've thought about
but
agreement.
To press just a little bit more then.
Okay.
What about the non-academic,
Yep.
the everyday person out there?
Yep.
How would they see what truth is? And again, I'm going to press you on the Rudy Giuliani thing. Is there some legitimacy to the average person out there who's hearing the facts are in dispute from their perspective?
Right.
So what is truth?
Right. So there's an interesting tendency that we have, one that is both a limitation potentially, but also some cause for encouragement. I think we all believe that there is truth. And we have an orientation towards information whereby we tend to, and there's an old philosophical, psychological debate between a guy named Spinoza and another named Descartes as to what we do with information when we encounter it. And the short version of this is that we tend to actually accept information at face value and then later figure out what to do with it. We might tag it as being false, but that leaves the door open for our acceptance potentially of misinformation. So on the one hand, we have that vulnerability. On the other hand, we are oriented towards an assumption that truth is possible, and it is what we see and believe. That means that within any individual person, there's room for growth and evolution, and so and within a scientific field, there's room for things to change. But Ruth, to go back to your version of this, in terms of if we were to walk out on the street right now and to ask that question, I do think people believe in the possibility of truth, and I believe that people believe in their ability to use their faculties to judge that. So it's what people believe. Of course, that opens a door, and it means that people are potentially operating on false assumptions and false beliefs, and therein lies some of the philosophical challenge with this. But people's perceptions do matter. So respectfully then, to go to Mr. Giuliani's quote on this, I think there is veracity in the idea that people are able to operate on what's before them, and that there are possibilities for people to disagree and to have different perceptions of the same objective reality. That said, we think sometimes that is perhaps overstated, maybe willfully so, and in a way that's not particularly helpful. And insofar as that statement's made in a way that is intended to deceive, ironically, that's a problem. And so that's maybe about as far as...
Okay, fair enough. Right? I pressed you enough. Let me pick up on a point that you just made. I think it's easy to blame the media, to blame companies who develop materials that are designed to promote their own interest in this whole concept. But I also understand, and there was an essay in the book that focused on this, that human nature apparently and perhaps unknowingly, unwittingly, plays a role as well here. It's not just Rudy Giuliani. It's not just pharmaceutical companies that have ads on TV. But we have it's in our DNA almost to think about these issues. That there is actually a human tendency to be misled. Can you talk a little bit about what that human tendency is?
Right. So I don't know if I necessarily go so far as to say that we have a tendency to be misled, as much as we have our tendency for engagement with the world leaves open the possibility of deception. And that's been true long before social media. That's been true as long as we've been making sense of the world. And that's what we do. We try to make sense of the world. And so insofar as we are accepting information at face value, that's useful if you're in the forest and you are making sense of potentially a bear, snapping a twig, and you're reacting to that stimulus. Maybe it makes it a bit more of a challenge in the mediated environment that we're in right now. But we are not necessarily. Our thought is, at least many of the people in this book, and I'll speak at least for myself, we have this tendency of not necessarily being able to completely screen out, BS, if you will, to screen out false information and just not engage with it. We actually have to take it in and make sense of that, and maybe can make judgment about it. But the truth is that we're still holding that piece of information. That matters, I think, as a human tendency. And so that's something that we've talked about. It's also the case that correcting misinformation can be a challenge, but it's possible. But we know that once certain ideas are activated, that you, by virtue of having activated nodes in the brain, you have made salient certain ideas, and that can be sometimes difficult to overcome. That in fact what we might need to do is build an architecture of correction around what already exists there. And the other human tendency, if you will, or a tendency of our 21st century is the mediated environment that we live in. And so one of the things that has perhaps changed is the pace of information flow. And that's something that people are worried about as potentially being dysfunctional in the current moment. But it's not fair to say that this is entirely a problem of the 21st century. This is a problem that we have had as long as we've been telling each other stories, as long as we've seen strategic advantage in lying to one another, as long as we have been trying to make sense of the world, and that's been a long time.
Well, actually, that's a nice segue into it. I just want to read literally the opening paragraph to the book.
Okay.
Misinformation, both deliberately promoted and accidentally shared, is a noteworthy and perhaps inevitable part of the world in which we live. People likely have lied to one another for roughly as long as verbal communication has existed. Deceiving others can offer an apparent opportunity to gain strategic advantage, to motivate others to action, or even to promote interpersonal bonds. Moreover, people inadvertently have been sharing inaccurate information with one another for thousands of years. But I bet everybody in the room here would agree it seems worse than it's ever been. Is this just a question of social media? Is this just because we've got all these new technologies out there? What do we attribute to what seems to be an increase in misinformation and deception, for that matter?
No, it's an excellent question. An example that pops to mind, is the philosopher's book, The Prince by Machiavelli, in which for hundreds of years we've had this recognition of the possibility of maybe manipulating information for larger intent. As we speak about this, we're having this conversation, in the United States in the 21st century, and there have been a number of pundits and observers who have suggested that our civic culture, that the rules seem to have shifted on that, and I think that the possibilities for deception have long been with us. I think that there are examples where we've seen consequential deception. I think that the championing of that as a political strategy in a cynical way, we've certainly, I think, seen some examples of that. That's problematic. It's problematic partly because we've long been vulnerable, not because we're newly vulnerable. And so I think that's, and ultimately the utility of that strategy is an interesting debate and question as well. There's been short-term advantage in lying for a long time. But we also, and I hold on to this, that eventually we need to think about the predictive value of information. And then eventually, prediction and it's the ability of information to predict or not rises. And that's something that we find out only in the longer term sometimes, but that might be a way through some of this. And there might be less satisfaction with the short-term cynicism over the long term. It's just a matter of whether we can get to that point. But that's, I think it's fair to say that there are normative differences in terms of the utilization of it, the weaponization of it, and perhaps the active use and promotion. But there are examples that are analogous all through history, I think, as well.
So let me jump to at least one of the solutions that's posed in the book. One of the answers to how to fix the question about misinformation is to, and I'm quoting again from the book, offer explicit corrections to specific information, not to do that, but rather to train citizens to recognize misinformation from the start. I'm going to now specifically talk about this in the context of health and healthcare.
Okay.
So how do we do that? And I'm going to give 3 examples. So, for example, how do we train citizens to know what to believe about direct-to-consumer advertising? And more specifically, I am talking about the ads that we see on television all the time for various drugs that are targeted consumers to go find their physician and say, this is what I want, and if you don't prescribe it, I'm just going to go to the next doctor and get it from him. I'm going to give you all 3, and maybe you want to combine an answer. Secondly, how do we train our young people about what to believe about Juul, the vape or electronic cigarette device that delivers a hit of nicotine like a cigarette, but some argue is the key to reducing smoking and getting those addicted off the habit? And finally, how do we train citizens to deal with the following situation that is actually cited in one of the proposals that we all heard about earlier this morning and has to do with vaccines? In March 2018, the CDC released a new YouTube video about infant hepatitis B vaccination. 2 months later, these are incredible numbers, that video had only 91 views and 0 likes, shares, or comments. In contrast, a recommended video from a physician who adopted an anti-vaccination stance had been released just 5 months earlier and already had accrued 318,000 views and 6,000 likes. How are we going to educate people from the start to know this is misinformation and how to deal with it?
Let me start with the last example, and I'll work my way back to some of the others. So some of you might have seen the paper in Science that much of the news coverage focused on this notion that false information spreads faster and further than true information. And actually, I've had a good opportunity to talk with some of the co-authors about that paper, and that's somewhat of a fair framing, but it misses part of what's happening, I think, in that arena. And that I'm not sure if it's necessarily the fact of falsehood, if you will, which is the reason why some of this is spread, but rather the strategic and rhetorical advantage that people have in focusing on sensational topics, in thinking about ways to make information spreadable, in which you allied reference to academic literature and strip other things away, and you're trying to tell a story. So it's something about the structure and the nature and the content of some of those claims, which is part of the reason why those spread. There's also, I think, on the part of our great colleagues who are doing public health work in all kinds of ways, sometimes a lack of ability to really generate the same kind of exposure to begin with than some commercial advertising efforts or other instances. And so there is, we have to account for exposure. I'm not sure if it's necessarily a matter of simply people not being interested, but rather to what extent were those, the CDC video put out in a way that could have gained that kind of traction. That's one thing just to think about. I want to offer a comment. You went directly to direct-to-consumer prescription drug advertising. I need to disclose that we have a relationship with the Food and Drug Administration at RTI International, where we have done a lot of work in the arena of correction and public understanding of direct-to-consumer prescription drugs. So I want to be careful I'm not speaking on behalf of FDA or even with much critique directly of that work, but rather to note that they exist in a way that I think is an interesting metaphor for what we might talk about here, and that they are offering critique and comment and evidence and regulation of an existing information environment in many instances. So helping people make sense of the advertising environment as it's out there. Not preventing inaccurate advertisements from making their way onto the air. They don't have that regulatory authority, but rather they are requesting correction, for example, if need be, but they are responding to quote unquote, and this is a phrase that they use sometimes, bad ads that are out there. And that work suggests that actually you can correct misperceptions that arise, but you need to do so with equal firepower in terms of exposure, relatively immediate and direct and clear claims that this was an error or a mistake, and that's important. And so the point that you raised with regards to Jewel. Again, I think what's probably important for me to comment on with regards to that is there's an objective discussion we might have about what the right public health outcomes are, what the behaviors are that we ought to be promoting. I'm not in a position to necessarily offer that comment as much as I can say there are ways that we could support people in their informed decision making about what they're doing. And so that's something that we'd hope for people to be able to make decisions under a situation of full and accurate information. Whether we ought to be encouraging people to do X versus Y, that's maybe a slightly different discussion. I mean, that's important because I think it's easy for us to get up on a high horse here with regards to misinformation and assume that it's all attributable to the people doing and having values and having other goals other than what we have. And that's a problem. Misinformation is not, does not belong to one political party. It does not belong to one domain. It does not belong, and it's something that we all are not only capable of sharing, we're also capable of promoting and generating under the right circumstances. And so that's, I think, important. I think that ultimately, so how do we teach people to engage in this environment? I think that the notion of encouraging literacy is one that's attractive in a lot of ways. I know that there have been some really great new initiatives, and we're talking about different initiatives here today. And what's important about that is encouraging people to be an active part of this information ecosystem and environment, to make sense of what's out there, to be able to make judgments, to offer people ideas about credibility cues. That's important, I think. The possibility of completely scrubbing misinformation from the system is a possibly draconian solution, even though it might be appealing under some circumstances, that we may ultimately really regret if we were to go down that road. Because in my mind, there is a great possibility for that to be a larger, to use a larger phrase, and ultimately become censorship in a way that I don't think many of us would be comfortable
And there is,
with.
of course, this little thing called the Constitution of the United States,
Right.
To
Right.
which people are entitled to free speech.
Right.
Let me just ask one more question, then I want to open this up to all of you, because I suspect it's on everybody's minds with the midterm elections coming up. How would you generally rate the political ads that we see on TV in terms of the misinformation meter, and how effective are fact-checking organizations in trying to keep us on track?
Right. Well, I think that there are a number of colleagues who are really doing serious content analysis work to kind of figure out what's currently in this cycle and what's out there right now. And I think that what's striking about that is that folks that have done that work have found inaccurate claims for a number of years, and that this has been something that now the extent to which we are more reliant on what's online as opposed to what's on a broadcast channel, that's worth noting, because it's possible for information to spread via social media, for example, and a different set of eyes being on that potentially. So the question of whether or not fact-checking entities and initiatives work is an interesting one. I think it's partly dependent on what we mean by work, right? And it's open to, I think it's unfair to suggest that all fact-checking efforts are equal. They're not. I think it's unfair to say that we have perfected that art, per se, yet. We haven't. The question, though, about the efficacy of having such things is an interesting one, because you might think, does this lead people to make more informed decisions? Well, there are a lot of factors that figure into the decisions that people make. And I'm not sure that fact-checking ever could or should be solely persuasive in terms of moving a political system in one way or the other. However, I think there is evidence that under the right circumstances, people can engage with that information, make sense of it, and find it potentially useful or compelling. But I want to point out an indirect possibility, and that is, what if fact-checking entities and initiatives matter not solely because of their impact on voters, but rather the fact that we have such things, the existence of them, introduces to all of us, there's a psychological affordance for the possibility that things might be wrong. Exactly. Well, that matters too, right? And so I think one of the interesting dynamics here is that you've got folks that are doing that work are really faced with a challenging arena. And it's really easy for them to not fully succeed or to be criticized or critiqued. But I think we need to make sure that we're not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good there as well. I think there are a lot of laudable efforts that probably are not universally successful, but that nonetheless their existence matters for us as a way forward, and that we could maybe do better and maybe we should try. But I'm not sure that I'm ready to suggest that there's no utility in them at all, as some might suggest. I think that it matters. What's interesting is we do have a lot of new initiatives, which some people in the room would suggest that what we've really done is rediscover our need for journalism.
Okay,
Right.
great.
Yep.
I've got a million more questions, but I want to give all of you an opportunity. If you raise your hands, we've got two folks with microphones. I would ask that you just give us your name, and if you're affiliated with an organization, let us know, and we'll try and get to as many people as we can. Right here. Yep.
And if you ask me what is truth again, I'm going to walk out of the room.
I even told them I was going to ask them that one.
And it still didn't help, did it?
I'm Michael Glosserman. I'm just a supporter of the Aspen Institute. To what extent do you think that artificial intelligence is either a positive or negative with respect to this issue?
That's a fascinating question that I actually was thinking about just the other day. Let's consider for the moment this question, just to not turn it back on you, but just to raise it. Is it likely or possible that artificially intelligent beings will lie to one another? I actually think that it is, because there are situations where rationally there will be strategic advantage in hiding certain elements of the truth. So I think artificial intelligence is a tough, difficult topic to discuss, because we're at the beginning of hockey stick curve, evolution of what's going to be coming and what's possible. And so it's almost better to be thinking in terms of philosophically what may happen as opposed to where we are right now. I think there are instances where some artificially intelligent entities have the advantage or the different approach of not having human emotion figure into their interpretation. And that is, from a romantic perspective, not great, but from an objective perspective, I think there's probably some utility in that. So there's probably some advantage designed in the right way. I don't think there's anything inherent to prevent those types of systems or from being vulnerable to manipulation and to deception, ultimately. And I think that, unfortunately, for better or worse, we are still part of the starting stage and condition for this, and it may be a matter of what we help to design or co-design with what's coming. I'm not sure that it's not a panacea. It's not, and it doesn't, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean the end of the world either. But I appreciate you raising that, because it's a challenge for us to think about.
And it's coming up.
Right.
Other questions? I'm going to try and go back across the room. Yes, right here.
Mark Canada, IU Kokomo, Indiana University Kokomo. I'm interested in the cultural aspects of this as well. And you got me thinking when you mentioned the YouTube video that went viral. And it occurred to me that the people's appetite for conspiracy theory and appetite for we're not getting the truth, I want the real truth behind the government statement or whatever, that's got to play a big role too. And that's been around for a long time, but it seems like it keeps getting more and more.
What I find, so let's think about that for a minute. We worry about that, or some people do, right? But there's something fundamentally human about, and think about that notion. We hunger for the truth, right? So there is an interest that people have, and there's an acknowledgement that there could be truth, and that our current system isn't delivering that to folks. So I think ultimately where that leaves us is perhaps in a better spot to have agreement with and collaboration with folks who believe in conspiracy theories, because ultimately, if trust is a function of shared value, we may be able to convince all of ourselves that we have this shared interest in the truth ultimately. And I think that's really important as a starting spot, because I may have had the advantage of different degrees or access to information or all of that, but my base humanity is no more or less scared or fearful or in need of understanding of what the heck is happening in the world with climate change and politics and all that. And so when I'm thinking about that at 2 in the morning, I'm just in the same spot as those folks, I think. So to me, it's more a matter of an opportunity for respect, and then maybe for us to talk about what tools we're using and bringing to bear to try to get to that spot. So I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but it seems to me like there's almost that, I view that as a greater hunger for truth, even though we've worried about sort of being in this post-truth world. I don't buy that. I don't think that we are, because I don't know that as humans we ever will fully let go of the idea that reality can exist somehow. And so, I don't know.
And the truth is to be found.
And the truth is out there. Sorry.
Other questions? Yes. If wait for the microphone.
Okay. Hi, Susan Jacobson from FIU. So it's sort of building on your study of FDA commercials. I have to say, once you get diagnosed with cancer, you suddenly realize that those cancer drug commercials are everywhere.
Yeah.
And there's a couple in particular that I know at least the breast cancer ladies are kind of up in arms about.
Okay.
The first one is the Opdivo advertisement, which was a multimedia campaign. It's not for breast cancer, but it's like live longer, you know, in big words with very little like, oh, it might be 2 months more or whatever it is. So there's that aspect of the advertising. Yeah. There's also right now an advertisement on TV called for Ibrance, a drug for advanced breast cancer. And you see a woman going about her life with her family. She's not fatigued. She doesn't seem to have any of the side effects that we know Ibrance can cause. And so there's a lot of discussions just about the representation, you know, of the people in some of these advertisements. So I wonder if those kinds of issues maybe come in your research.
You know, and thank you for sharing your story, you know, too, by the way. So I think what's very compelling, there's a lot that's compelling in that example that you just raised. But part of what I want to pick up on, actually, is the example of an advertisement. Because an advertisement's much more than a couple of words, isn't it? An advertisement is all the visual dimension, it's the music, the soaring music underneath. There are different types of claims even within. And even FDA would sort of segment those to some degree and argue that there's some difference between a risk statement and the other parts. So the extent to which everything fits together, the extent to which some can distract, the extent to which some might activate certain tendencies on our part, all of that I think has to feature into the equation too. So that's part of why your example is so interesting, is that there is a lot going on in a political ad, in a prescription drug ad, even in any time we're taking in sort of a larger discussion. Think about our conversation right here, right now. I mean, there are different elements of it. There's the verbal dimension, there's the nonverbal part of it. And so I think that's something that folks working in this arena have not fully solved yet. Actually, just to offer a brief comment on the larger event, or the day-long event that this lunch meeting is situated in the middle of, there's been some really helpful and good acknowledgement of that. But that's where a lot of some of the new activity and interest is, trying to understand truth in the context of visual communication. Visual communication, my old professor, Paul Maceras, would point out, is really slippery and difficult for us because we don't have the same kind of rules logically for understanding truth or veracity as we do with the way we understand language, right? And so you think about images juxtaposed or other ways in which we certainly can imply certain things that many audience members will get out of that, but it's tougher to pin people down as to what exactly that was intended to mean. And so I think all of that's really important. We need to have new scholarship in that arena. There's a really healthy and robust visual communication scholarship that sometimes gets ignored in these debates or in these explorations or discussions. I think that needs to be brought in to this a lot more than it has been. But the other thing that you're pointing out is that there are many different domains that we might learn from. So we're having this discussion here today about health. But I don't think we ought to solely cordon that off. There's a lot we could learn from political scientists. There's a lot we could learn from folks working in interpersonal communication and deception and psychology and other areas as well. So we should do that.
Yes, over here. All the way on at the end. Hold on, we're waiting for the mic.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
One word that hasn't come up in your discussion yet is greed, which is such a big part, I think, of the health and medical sphere. I'm wondering what can be done to discourage that in med schools, in universities in general, and specifically, why do you think so many people were suckered into Theranos, and what can be done to prevent a future Theranos?
So,
Okay, Brian,
I know.
let's go to it.
exactly. Thanks again. This is an easy room.
Yep.
It's
I
so-
told you, it's a
I
tough
know-
crowd.
No, it's great. These are the kind of
Yep.
conversations we should be having. What's really great about your question, is the emphasis on human motivation. Dietram Scheffler this morning, we had some remarks, and he sort of noted that needs to be part of the equation here as well. And there's only so much we can do, in terms of offering a remedy for misinformation that is going to. We can't eliminate profit motives. We can't necessarily eliminate the larger ethical considerations. We can have that debate and sensitize people to that, but I think there are larger considerations there. These are mechanisms that have been used because they are useful. And that's part of the point that we have to, and the value judgment we might have as to what people are doing with that or why they're doing that, that's a larger discussion. So as to how we could, I think it's important to acknowledge that people have been vulnerable under some circumstances. I think what we can do to prevent, part of it is going to be a matter of transparency about our collective tendencies. I think that efforts that we have to help people navigate the system, make sense of information as it's out there, is important. We are getting there. There's sort of a wax and wane that happens with new communication technologies that emerge, that I also want us to point out. I think for me, it's really interesting to look back at the history of when other technologies were new. Things like radio and television, and some of the hand-wringing that happened at that point, and some of the shifts and changes that have had to happen in terms of a regulatory structure and in terms of our collective response to it. Part of what I want to leave us with, I guess, is the encouragement to know that I think there are things that can be done about it. I think we all collectively have to be looking at this not as the end of the world, but rather an issue that's arisen that if we don't fix could be dysfunctional for us. But that we have some capacity for doing, and we have a lot of examples of instances where, think about this country that we live in. There are an awful lot of policy and regulatory decisions that have been made that have hopefully improved things relative to the awful circumstances that existed before. And I think owning and embracing the possibility that we've got some really screwed up dynamics right now doesn't mean that we can't be proud of the future that we could have together by creating some new solutions. So, yeah.
To follow up on this gentleman's
Great, Rich,
question
yeah.
on the fairness thing,
Yeah.
is there a difference from the way you think about this, misinformation versus what I think many people would say in the case of fairness is out and out fraud?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, this is an interesting angle here, in that we have, as we did in the beginning part of the conversation, I think it's important to sensitize ourselves to the fact of and the possibility of misinformation that is not actively promoted. So there is misinformation that exists outside of disinformation as a subset. That said, under no circumstances do I think that we ought not to be, in a robust way, dealing with fraud in all the ways that we have. I mean, I absolutely think there's a place for that. I think that we can all agree that this rhetorical strategy is not fair, and that is something that we probably want collectively to do something about. And from that standpoint, this is not to let people off the hook in terms of active deception.
Understand, yeah.
And that, I think, when it can be detected, we have a legal system that there are rules for that. There are mechanisms that, if used appropriately and thoroughly, could be used as places of remedy.
Other questions? I'll go back to the middle again. And again, if you'd remember to introduce yourselves, please.
Hi, I'm Roberta Millman. I'm a former healthcare policy consultant.
Great.
And I'm kind of interested in getting concrete. You
Okay.
talk about potential solutions or ways of educating people.
Yeah.
And I'd like to know some of your ideas about doing that. Some of it is like, how do you consider whether apricot pits cure cancer, or vaccines cause autism, or even how you get through all the hype about certain doctors or hospitals and figure out what's real about them and what's truth. So the literacy of the consumer, of the people ads are being directed at, how do you get at that except very individually?
Yeah. So there is something I want to acknowledge is that we would be in trouble if we didn't allow for science to evolve in terms of our understanding. And so there's an angle to this where it becomes a little bit challenging, because there are things that we know as scientific consensus now that are different than 30 or 40 years ago. And so that room for evolution is a part of doing science. We're talking about health, and we're talking about very specific health circumstances, but I actually want to introduce the possibility for solution in a civic sphere. I actually think that part of what we might focus on is thinking about the societal and the communication infrastructure that we have. And so for me, this might sound like a strange stretch, but I actually think there's something really important about knowing your neighbors. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think that we live in a society where we are at risk of atomizing ourselves by virtue of our individual connections through our cell phones into this larger ecosystem that where we're not necessarily as directly connected in smaller, more local social networks. There's value in small-scale networks in terms of helping one another make sense of the world, being able to verify and check information. There's been a discovery of this in the disease and public health communities. As you think about online discussion groups and support groups and others, part of the value in that is folks operating as small-scale efforts to be able to vet information, to be able to make sense of it. And I think, just as we've seen, there's real value in creating community in neighborhoods. I think not just for the sake of the civic sphere and politics. I think in terms of making sense of health information, that's also a way forward here. So actually, I'm trying to understand, I think the first place we need to go is to avoid automatically demonizing folks that have accepted, under some circumstances, these pieces of misinformation. Because if we were to do that, if all of a sudden those folks become really problematic, then my father is an issue, right? Or there are others that, where he inadvertently would send something on Facebook that, and this is an example that I've raised before, inadvertently because of a tremor in his finger from Parkinson's disease, where something got sent, where those kind of accidents can happen. We all are vulnerable to that. So I think the degree to which we can build local community as a way forward here, I think is really important. Building this into part of our educational system in a way that this is part of the education as to what it means to be alive in the 21st century, I think is another important piece. But then another piece of this is thinking about how we train public health professionals, health services professionals, others to work alongside and to not necessarily have a highfalutin attitude about what's right and what's wrong, but rather to acknowledge that there are people that are trying to make sense of the world out there, that occasionally that might even be a source of information and innovation, to allow that to be part of the information set that physicians and other folks are using as well. That may not be the most satisfying answer, but I think reaching into and helping us build discussions like what we're having today. It matters a lot that you show up in person and talk to people sometimes. And I thank you all for being here and spending time on this. And I think that what we can't do is just answer this with a brochure or with an intervention that isn't rooted in the day in, day out sort of interactions that we need to have as in a healthy society. So,
Yes, in the front here, please.
Thank you. I'm Denise Rollard Barnes, and I'm publisher of the Washington Informer newspaper here in Washington, D.C., and I kind of want to flip the conversation. I'm not promoting a movie, but I got a chance to screen a movie this week called The Oath that comes out next week. And the reason why I bring this up was because in the film, it really is based around what I hope everybody will be doing next month, is sitting around the Thanksgiving table with family. And of course, when we do that, at least in my household, there's always a conversation that leads to, how do you know that's true? Prove it. Where did you get that information from? And so that sometimes leads to, well, this is a media source that I trust. So I want to talk about the word trust and trusted media, and what your thoughts are about media or resources that try to impress people that this is a trusted source.
Yeah.
And if I can follow up on that a little bit too, this is one of the questions I didn't get to.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Is to what extent is this a problem because we have a breakdown in trust in this country, whom to trust, whom we can rely on, and to what extent does that factor into all of this? So thank you,
Yeah,
great question.
that's a great question. I mean, and I think it'd be a shame if we had a meeting like this today, or, and the notion of trust didn't come up, because I think it absolutely is important. I think that the notion of being able to acknowledge and understand shared interests really is often at the root of trust, and it turns out to be a much more important barrier to communication or acceptance of information than we often give credit for. So I think we could spend a lot of time really focused on that notion and sort of building trust. It may be that we also are seeing growing pains here, or some issues with scope and scale and abstraction. And it may be that we talk about artificial intelligence, but at the end of the day, we are human, and there may be a size of country, of population, of audience that is large enough that where it's difficult for all members there to really be able to believe fully that there is shared or vested interest, per se. And so that may be something that we may need to build back up to by virtue of some of these smaller scale communities. That and so that's something. If you think about as that happens around the dinner table, those are probably really good discussions that happen. Partly because there's a sense, well, we're at least in the same family, or there's some shared vantage point that we have here. But I do think that the flattening of the information landscape is problematic, in that we have, on the one hand, in a healthy democratic way, lowered the barrier to entry for entities to be online. But yet there was really, and again, this is what I meant. I didn't mean to be overly cute with that, of sort of rediscovering journalism. But I think that we eventually are going to recognize that our only way through this are going to be folks that can offer some guideposts and interpretation, and that can serve as institutions that might need to be reinvested with audience trust to be able to move forward. So maybe we've had a breakdown, and in some of those circumstances, maybe it's a useful wake-up call that there has to be an establishment of trust and rapport between an media institution and the audience that they serve going forward, and it's become too easy for things to sort of appear online. So I don't know, Denise, when you all have those conversations, or are there ideas rooted in the conversation around the movie that give us a path forward at all? What do you think?
I'm sorry.
Well, I don't know if there are other solutions that that popped to mind in watching the movie or at Thanksgiving dinner table that you wanted to raise.
No, I mean, the film's hilarious. I have to
Okay.
say that. So I think if anybody gets a chance to see it, I'm not promoting it, but if you want a good laugh, you'll find one there. And I think it got to the point that you're saying, when you're around the table with people that you trust, and you're in a safe environment to have conversations, you're challenging attitudes and opinions, which means that, which I've been hearing in some of the forums, where now that person who just automatically reads something knows that they need to go back and do more research and to look at differences of opinion and different sources, so that they don't automatically consume misinformation.
Right. And I also just want to build on that, just to offer one additional point here that risks undermining the premise of the whole book, just for a moment. Because I want to acknowledge that in terms of thinking about behavioral theory, in terms of thinking about the way that societies interact, we under no circumstances are suggesting that acceptance of factual information is sort of the only strategy or game in town or motivator of human behavior or any of that. It's a piece of a larger equation. It's a piece. There are reasons why people are interacting the way that they are, and some of it is complicated by the dysfunction of having misinformation as a part. But what we don't want to do is suggest that somehow the path forward is if only everybody had accurate information, every problem would be solved. That isn't what we're suggesting or arguing at all. It's just that there is a quirk and circumstance of our moment where this is not only a topic that many people are bandying about in a way that itself is not always fair, and sort of using that as a political weapon, but it is a phenomenon that seems to be almost inevitable and that we do need to make sense of if we're going to be designing better information systems in the future. So.
We've got time for one or two more questions. Over here. Microphone. Oh, there we go.
Thank you. My name is Mihai. I'm a PhD student at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign.
Great.
And we've kind of seen around the room, and you also mentioned there's different facets of tackling this problem, right? There's educating people, there's empowering journalists, crowdsourcing, artificial intelligence. And are you aware of anybody kind of doing this meta-analysis of what should be the most important things to work on first and kind of comparing everything together? Because, you know, if we know that 10 years from now we can have artificial intelligence solve this problem, why do the people need to be educated? So, you know, that's just one example, but is anybody trying to do this work? I'm just curious.
Well, no. So with that, you may have a dissertation topic for yourself right there. So I want to also acknowledge that part of our motivation in putting the book together was to offer a look at the landscape and a starting place. But we have the happy and good fortune, I think, in this book of acknowledging that there's an agenda for future work, that we really need to try to first get our hands around some of these concepts, acknowledge that some of them, to some extent, it's overstated. In other instances, this is something we really need to worry about. Think about all the domains where that touches, but in terms of a large scale across the, part of the issue, actually, Mihai, is that people are often operating in these academic silos, per se. So we're really encouraged. If you think about the types of backgrounds that are in a room like this right now, this is great, but this is somewhat rare. And so what I've seen happen more so are folks developing the technology solution, or they're developing the education-based solution, or they're developing the journalism reform solution, and they're not all talking.
The same place.
No, and that we need to address, but it's hard. Ruth can attest to pulling those types of folks together. We don't often have shared vocabulary. We aren't socialized in the same way in terms of research. We aren't publishing in the same journals. We aren't, and so really, despite the challenges with the definition, despite everything else, the book starts with the word misinformation because we want it to be a focal point to bring together these different points of solution in this arena that has to be interdisciplinary. So I really hope that you and your colleagues will continue to do some of that. But in terms of a comparison of apples and oranges yet, I think it's possible from a meta-analysis standpoint to do that, but that work is, I've reviewed a few things where people have done, and I know folks at NCI, Danielle Kelly and others are doing a look at the literature, as it exists right now in terms of measures. But in terms of interventions that work, there's a debate there to be had, and welcome to further work in that arena. Yeah.
One last question. Nobody? Wow. Very good. I'll let you out early.
Excellent.
Please join me in thanking Brian for being with us here today.
Can I offer one thing?
Yes,
and so
please do.
in welcoming you to, so I want to thank RTI International for the donation here to make possible all the copies of the book. We hope you enjoy that. We want to also start a larger conversation about this. So we are having people opt into a larger collection of and a mailing list for all of this at misinfosolutions.org. You'll find, I think, maybe reference to that out at the book as well. But if you go to just misinfosolutions.org, you'll see an intake form with name and fields for email address and all that. And so feel free to contribute there. We're trying to get a sense of the folks that are out there and interested in opting into a larger discussion about this. But I also want to thank folks here just for the opportunity to talk with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks to our staff, and particularly Katja Wander, some of whom I think some of you have had an opportunity to meet her. And most particularly, thanks to all of you for being here and for being such an engaging audience. It's great to have you, and we'll see you next time. Thank you again,
Great,
Brian.
thanks.
Good.
That was great. Yeah, thank you for that.
Now you get a little.